Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis. 3 lines from the top, from the 2 dots. After the Gemara concluded that Beis Shammai is of the opinion of Shvisas Kelim, whether it's actively done a malacha on Shabbos or the Kelim do a passive malacha on Shabbos, it's going to be also midiyaraisa. According to Beis Hillel, there's no such iser Shvisas Kelim. Says the Gemara, Man Tana Laha. Who is the Tana that teaches the following brayso? The Tana Rabbanon. For it was taught in the brayso, Lo timale isha kedeiro asosiois vertumosin. A woman cannot fill up her oven, not with these type of beans that have a prolonged amount of time in order for them to cook. V'taniach l'toich hatanur erev Shabbos, and put them inside on erev Shabbos, im chashecha, before nightfall. V'im nosnon lemotzoi Shabbos asurim b'kedei sheyasu. If indeed they are placed in the oven before Shabbos, then after Shabbos they cannot be used kedei sheyasu. Means that there's going to be a penalty for the person who did that. That in order them to get any benefit from those beans, they would have to then cook the beans. It would be enough time to cook the beans again for Motzei Shabbos. So, for example, if the beans required a full 24 hours, and these are the beans that indeed, if you put them on before Shabbos, they're only ready till Motzei Shabbos, then a person cannot benefit from those beans until Sunday night. Says the Gemara, Ki yoytze boy, the Brisa continues, similarly, Lo yemale nachtoim chavi shel mayim, a baker cannot place a jug of water, v'yaniach l'toich hatanur, erev Shabbos im chashech, and put it inside of his oven in order to then warm up that water so that make it easy for him to knead the dough after Shabbos. So he cannot place that before Shabbos. V'im also kain lemotzai Shabbos asurim b'kedei sheyasu. And if he did do so by putting it into the oven before Shabbos, then he cannot have any benefit from that water until kedei sheyasu. Again, if it takes a few hours, let's say 4 hours, to heat up the water entirely in that oven, then he'd have to wait 4 hours after the Shabbos in order to benefit from that water. Ask the Gemara Lema, or suggest the Gemara Lema Beis Shammai hi v'lo Beis Hillel. Let us suggest and say that this brayso that we just quoted is authored by Beis Shammai, who is of the opinion of Shvisas Kelim, and not Beis Hillel. Says the Gemara, no, afilu tema Beis Hillel. You can even say that this brayso is authored by Beis Hillel, because gezeira shema yechate begecholim, because of a gezeira, a decree that perhaps a person will rake the coals, and therefore he'll be over. If he were to rake the coals, he'd be over an isur deraisa of havara, of kindling a flame. So the Chachamim made a gezeira that a person should not be able to then put such a dish, anything, in this case, shouldn't put the beans, for example, on the tanur before Shabbos if it's open, because he can easily stoke, he can easily rake the coals and then cause an isur d'oraisa. So therefore, that's could even be the opinion of Beis Hillel. Ask the Gemara, asked the Gemara, Mugmar v'gafris nami ligzor. If that's the case, that Beis Hillel is concerned about maybe raking the coals, and therefore it would be usher even to put this before Shabbos, then he should also oyser that which it states earlier in the brayso, that a person cannot put a gafris, sulfur, underneath metalware before Shabbos. They did that in order to then cause the sulfur to rise into the metal and then bring out the picture that is on that metal. If there's, let's say, a flower that was engraved in that metal, then the blackened sulfur would cause it to be more readily, easily seen. Or they would put mugmar, they would put incense underneath clothing in order for the clothing to then smell good. So you cannot do that before Shabbos, and Beis Hillel said you could. So why is that not a problem? Says the Gemara, Hasam lo machti lehu. There they would not rake the coals. Di machti solik behu kutro v'koshi lehu. Because by raking the coals, it would cause a smoke to envelop, and that would ruin the clothing or the metalware. Ask the Gemara further, Unin shel pishto nami ligzor. Why does Beis Hillel matir the unin, the bundles of flax in the Mishnah? He should aser because maybe a person will then rake the coals. Hasam kiven the kashi luhuzika lo megalele, because the wind is bad for the flax. When we're trying to whiten the flax, it will ruin the flax, and therefore a person would not open up the tanur, and therefore it wouldn't be a concern that he would stoke the coals. Tzemer liyara ligzor. Ask the Gemara further. In the Mishnah it says that they would used to take the wool and they would put it into a big vat in order to then dye the wool. So why don't we make a gzeira that Shema Yechate according to Beis Hillel? Why does he matir it in the Mishnah? Omar Shmuel biyara akura. We're talking about a yara, this vat that was already removed from the fire. Ask the Gemara, V'nechu Shema magis ba. Good, it's removed from the fire. It's no longer a concern of maybe he will rake the coals, but he will maybe then stir the pot where the wool is in, and that will cause the wool to become cooked or dyed. And therefore that should be a problem. Says the Gemara, no, that's not a problem. Why? Because ba'akura vetucha, not only is the pot removed, this vat is removed from the flame, but it's also sealed, and therefore the sealing will remind the person not to then go ahead and magis and stir that pot. Says the Gemara, v'hashidomar mar gzeira shema yechate b'gecholim. Now that we have a concern of shema gzeira shema yechate, then hai kidera chayosa shari la'anucha erev Shabbos im chashecha betanura. But that pot that has raw meat inside of it, that should be permitted to put on erev Shabbos on the flame. Why? Because since raw meat takes hours and hours to cook, clearly he's not going to then have it ready by the night. Therefore, there won't be a concern that he will then stoke the coals. He won't rake the coals. And therefore, he'll have all night in order to then allow the cooking process to take effect. So we won't be concerned about Shema Yechate. And Gemara explains, Kivan, my time, what's the reason? Kivan the loichazi laorto asuche masach daite mine v'lo osi lachatuye gecholim. Since that he doesn't have any intention to eat it that night, it won't be fitting to eat. Therefore, he'll remove his das until already the next day, where anyway it's going to be cooked, and therefore there won't be a concern of then raking the coals. The Gemara goes on to explain, Ubashil, if it was fully cooked, Shapir Dami also wouldn't be concerned because of Shema Yechate, by putting that on the tanur, on the flame, before Shabbos. Bashil v'loi bashil, if it's partially cooked, osir, it should be a problem. It will be a problem, be osir. Because Shema Yechate. Maybe he'll then want to expedite the cooking process. So therefore, if he puts something that's only partially cooked before Shabbos, then this gzera exists of Shema Yechate. V'im shoda begarmo. However, if he puts a bone that has some meat inside of this partially cooked dish, then shapir dami, then it's okay, because we have the same svar that we said before. He's not going to intend to eat from this pot, since it still needs to be cooked for several more hours, and therefore it's only going to be ready the next day, in which there will be enough time to cook that dish, even without being mechate the flames. V'hashte the Omar Mar, now that Mar said, Kol midi de koshile zika lo megalile, that if something is going to then be ruined as a result of letting some wind inside of it, then hai bisra de gadya v'shorik shapir dami, then the basar, the meat of a young gedi, that should be okay if it's sealed. That will be okay if it's sealed, because you have two milas. You have the mila that the tender meat of the gedi is going to be ruined by the wind if you open up the tanur while it's being roasted. And so also, when you also have the seal, which is going to then prevent a person from then breaking that seal, which would be a hassle for him and also be a reminder to him not to do so. So because if you have both milas, therefore you can go ahead and put the bisra, the gidia, together with the seal on Erev Shabbos. The barcha v'lo sharik aser. However, if it's going to be a ram, which is more mature and the meat is tough, therefore the wind will not be a factor and will not bother its cooking process. And if it doesn't have a seal, then certainly it will be aser. The gadya v'lo sharik. What happens if you have one mila? You have the mila of gadya, where you don't want the wind to affect the tender meat, but it's not sealed. On the other hand, the baracha v'sharik, or you have a mature ram where the meat is tough, but you do have, and therefore the wind will not bother, but you do have the mila of being sealed. What would be the din in such cases? Says the Gemara Machlokes, Rav Ashi shari, Rav Yirmiyahu medifti osir. Rav Ashi says it's mutter, whereas Rav Yirmiyahu medifti says it's osir. In other words, the shaila is if one of the two, if you have one mila, if that's sufficient in order to be matir, according to Rav Ashi, that's enough. Rav Ashi deshari asked the Gemara. Now the Gemara says Vahatanya. Really, it's a Mishnah coming up on Daf Yutes Amud Beis. The Gemara asks from the following Mishnah: Ein soilin basar batzal ubeitzo. One cannot roast meat, onions, or eggs unless it was roasted already on Erev Shabbos. So how can you say that over here it's permissible to roast the meat that we're talking about over here? There's a kasha on Rav Ashi. Answers the Gemara, Hasom the baracha v'lo sharik. There in that Mishnah, the reason why it's aser to roast anything unless it's finished before Shabbos is because it's baracha v'lo sharik. It has both chisronos, the chisron of being a tough meat, and therefore the wind is not a concern, and also is not sealed. Ikedame, there are those that say the gadya bein sharik bein lo sharik shapir dami. When it comes to a gedi which has tender meat, so whether it is sealed or whether it's not sealed, then it's mutter, it's fine. The baracha, if it's a ram which has tough meat, nami also visharik shapir dami. Therefore, the wind is not a factor, and if it's sealed, then it's also good. So you have both milas. Ki pligi, when is there a machlokes? The baracha v'lo sharik. If you have tough meat of the ram, but it's not sealed, the Rav Ashi shari, Rav Yirmiyahu medifti osir. Rav Ashi says it's mutter. That's true. It's not sealed, but at least the fact that it's covered is sufficient. Where Rav Yirmiyahu says that's not good enough, and therefore it's osir. Ask the Gemara, Rav Ashi the shari, and that which Rav Ashi says is mutter over here in the case of baracha v'lo sharik, where it's not sealed. Again, Vatnan, the Mishnah Lekamon says, Ein solim baser batzal ubeitzo. You're not able to roast, not meat, and not onions, and not eggs, unless the entire thing is roasted before Shabbos. So how can you tell me that over here it would be mutter, according to Rav Ashi? Hasam bebisra agumri. There, the reason why it's aser to roast anything unless it's completely roasted before Shabbos is because we're talking about basar that is not in a tanur at all. It's in an open flame. And therefore, with an open flame, with open coals, that would be a concern. Omoravina, hai kro chaya, shapir domi. Ravina says, according to everybody, if you have a gourd that is a raw gourd, then it's shapir domi. You could go ahead and put it into the tanur. Why? Because you have kivan de kashi lezika kibistra k'adya damya. You have the mila, the fact that it's going to be ruining the gourd if you open up the door of the tanur, since the wind will then enter and it'll ruin the gourd. So therefore, it's like the bistra of gadya, and therefore that would be mutter. Now the Gemara quotes our Mishnah that Beishamai Omrim Ein Moichrin, you cannot sell various things to a goy if it's going to be right on Erev Shabbos. Tanu Rabbanan Beishamai Oimrim Lo Yimkar Adam Chefzo L'Nochri. The Brisa goes on to say that Beishamai says it's osur to sell an object to a Nochri on Erev Shabbos, right before Shabbos. V'lo Yashilenu, and you cannot lend to him. That's going to then have to be returned on Shabbos. V'lo Yalvenu, and you cannot lend him money. V'lo Yitein Lo B'matana, and you can't give him a gift. Ela Kadesh Yagil Lebeso, unless then it's going to then be enough time for him to arrive to his house while it's still Erev Shabbos. Because if it's going to be Shabbos, then it's going to look like the Jew then commissioned him to be on his behalf, and therefore he's using the chayfetz on behalf of the Jew. Ubeis Hillel oimrim kadesh yagil abayis hasamuch lechoimo. Beis Hillel says so long as it's going to be enough time for him to get to the wall in the vicinity of where he lives. Rabbi Akiva says no. Beis Hillel says that it's in order for him to leave the Jew's house. After that, there's not a concern that he's doing something on behalf of the Jew. The Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva, Amar Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda, Hein divrei Rabbi Akiva, Hein divrei Beis Hillel. Rabbi Akiva is coming to explain the words of Beis Hillel. It's not a machlokes. As follows, Lo ba Rabbi Akiva el lefaresh divrei Beis Hillel. To say it doesn't mean, Beis Hillel does not mean to say that he has to leave all the way until he gets to the chayma of his vicinity where he lives. Rather, Beis Hillel means to say that it's enough for a person to have the Gentile leave the Jewish home before Shabbos, then they won't be suspecting that the Jew commissioned him on his behalf.